Good evening, everybody. So we've gotten into a good habit, Baruch Hashem, that before fast days we do a little bit of an overview of the Selichos that are coming up. So as we've mentioned in the past, in Selichos of the fast days, we follow a sort of a framework. We have a template, which includes prayers which are somewhat easy to understand, basic Hebrew. We recite psukim that are relevant, and then at three intervals in the middle, there are three piyutim, three poems that we say, which by nature the poems are going to be more difficult to understand and follow and to sort of get all the references. So that's the agenda for tonight, is an overview of the three poems that we're going to be saying on Tanis Esther in the morning, this coming Thursday morning in Mitzvah Hashem. It's interesting, the other fasts when Mashiach comes, so the other fasts are going to be transformed into days of celebration. They will no longer be, that now in Golus, the days of mourning, and then they cease to be days of mourning. Tanis Esther is not a day of mourning. Tanis Esther is an Eis Rotzen, is a day of prayer, and even in the times of Mashiach, there'll also be a fast on Tanis Esther. Once we're fasting, so we also say Selichos, and even we say Kibitzara Gedola Anachnu, that we're in a day of distress, but at its core, it's not a day of mourning, it's a day of opportunity and closeness to Hashem, to daven, etc. So I'm actually going to start backwards, going from the third to the second and to the first, because I'm going to elaborate mostly on the first. So I want to get the general picture of the third, and then the second piyut, and then we'll go back to the first one. So the third piyut that we say on Tanis Esther, if you're following in the annotated siddur, is on page 439, and it's also in the handouts that I gave out with the color coding. So this piyut is called a pismon. The nature of a pismon is basically it has a chorus which is like a refrain. So there's the first paragraph of the poem, and then that first paragraph becomes a refrain that's repeated. Sometimes we repeat the entire first paragraph, sometimes we repeat just the first line of the first paragraph, but that's repeated in between each of the paragraphs. So if you look at page 439 in your siddur, you'll see that that's the first paragraph, and then Tehillas Yisrael Atu Yeshev, and the next paragraph is repeat, and so on and so forth. What are first of all, the very basic features of this poem? So first of all, every paragraph contains 4 phrases, and those phrases rhyme with each other. So for example, in the first paragraph, the one which is the refrain, B'msei misper chilinu fanecha, l'shavas necheim al talim aznecha, hakshiv tchinasa mishmei me'oinecha, and the same is true of the next paragraph, Yoshev, Koyeshev, Mechashev, Liashev, and so on and so forth. And if you look in the handouts, you'll see those are the words that I've color-coded in green. At least I just did it for the first few lines. So you get the point. That is the first feature of the poem. Then you also have the acrostic going through the poem. So the acrostic does not apply to the refrain, it just applies to the main body of the poem. And if you look at it, you'll see the first word, Tehillos, starts with a tuf. The next phrase, shin, starts with a shin, and it goes through the entire aleph base from end to beginning, tuf to aleph. And if you look on the handouts, those are the letters that I've color-coded in red, taking you all the way through from tuf to aleph. It's interesting. If you look at the second to last paragraph, so if you're in the annotated siddur, if you're on the handouts, it's on line 13, and in the annotated siddur, it's on page 440. Let's call it the second paragraph. I'm not counting the refrain as a paragraph; that's the smaller letters. But the second paragraph in the bigger letters on page 440. So the problem is there's 22 letters of the aleph base, but you have to divide it into 4 because each paragraph has 4 phrases, so you're going to end up with some doubles. So if you look on the handouts, by line 13, there's a double base and a double aleph, right? There's 2 phrases that start with base and 2 phrases that start with aleph, but somehow in the siddur, it's a different version. It's you have 1 base and then a random hey, followed by, and it's not even similar. On the handouts, it says, Ba'apcha kumal tzoyrer hatzar, And here it says Hashivenu lemnuchasecha ki yadcha leisiksar. So it's a completely different version of that line. Whatever the case is, I'm not sure how that comes to be, but that's it. And then the final paragraph are, if you look in the handouts, line 15 and 16. Those are the acrostic I've highlighted in the blue color. Spells out the word Meshulam, which is the name of the author of this poem, whom I do not know much about. There's some other piyutim from him, but not somebody whom I know too much about. Now, the feature of this, the theme of the tefillah is that just like in the days of Mordechai and Esther, Hashem listened to our prayers, so we're asking Hashem to do the same again now. Just a couple of pointers. In the refrain, so it says, Kivimei Moir v'Hadas, as in the days of Moir and Hadas, you saved your children, so too you should do now. Who are Moir and Hadas? So Moir and Hadas are Mordechai and Esther. What's Moir and Hadas got to do with Mordechai and Esther? So in this week's parsha, in Parsha K'siso, just happens to align with the parsha, you have the mitzvah to bring the spices, the fragrant spices, frankincense, for the Ketores. And the first one, we say it every morning in davening, Mar deror. So one of the ingredients of the Ketores is Mar deror, which the Unclus translates as Meirodachia. It's a whole interesting discussion of exactly what it is, but that's not for now. So the Gemara says that Mar deror, which in Aramaic translates as Meirodachia, well, Meirodachia is obviously very similar phonetically to Mordechai, so that's a reference to Mordechai. Now, so Moir is a reference to Mordechai. That's the spice. Hadas. So the Python has done here a very clever thing. Esther's name in the Megillah is given as Esther, or her Hebrew name is Hadassah. Hadas is a abbreviated version of Hadassah, but Hadas also has another meaning. Hadas is one of the Arba minim that we use on Sukkos, the myrtles, which have a pleasant fragrance, right? So by referring to Esther, not by Esther or Hadassah, but by Hadas, he's kind of created this imagery of Mordechai and Esther, Moir v'Hadas, two pleasantly fragrant things which are a reference to Mordechai and Esther. So that's a clever thing that he's done, that the Python has done over here. Just a couple of words that, again, you could read it in English. There's nothing so difficult here, but just a couple of pointers. At the end of the third paragraph, so if you're looking on your handouts, it's on line 6. There's an unusual word, which is nishtevonov, which the English Siddur, the Chabad English Siddur translates it as his edict. Nishtevonov is an Aramaic word which appears twice in the book of Ezra, and the Mefarshim say that it means the same thing as in the Megillah, Paschegen Haksav. Paschegen is also an edict. It's a Persian word that's in the Megillah. So in Ezra, it appears in its Aramaic form, Nishtevonov, and it means an edict. So it's an interesting thing. Now, when it comes to Haman and his children hanging on the eitz, on the tree. Now, when I was a kid, I was told the story that he was hanging on the gallows. But it's not 100% accurate. But two things have to be pointed out. First of all, when was Haman killed? Haman is killed on Pesach. There's a machloikus if it's second day Pesach or the third day Pesach. I think in Shulchan Aruch, if I recall correctly, it only mentions the second day Pesach. On the second day Pesach, you're supposed to have something special, extra special at your meal to honor the victory over Haman, because that's the day Haman was killed. When I was a kid, there used to be an individual, I don't know if he's still alive. If he is, Judge Morris, his name was. He used to come to shul on second day Pesach, and he used to say Kaddish. And then after davening, he would joke. Every year it was the same thing. He's saying Kaddish for Haman's yahrzeit. Anyway, so Haman is placed on this tree. I'm intentionally using vague words for now. He's placed on this tree on Pesach, but it implies in the Megillah and Chazal say b'feirush that Haman and his sons were hanging together on this tree, right? His sons were killed almost a year later, 11 months later. So the Ben Ish Chai writes in his Chuvas in Torah Lishma, that's his Chuvas that were written on a pseudonym, that Haman indeed remained there for the entire 11 months, And the purpose was that it was necessary. They were making a point that Haman should still be hanging there on display to everybody on the day by Yom HaSibra Yehudim, Oivei Yehudim, on that day to demonstrate that yes, Haman sent out the forged decree. That was the story they're going with, as the Ben Ezra explained, or as we saw yesterday, the Akedah learns of that Sakupshat. Whatever the case is, having on that day where the Jews are given to defend themselves, having Haman hanging for display for all to see is a very powerful imagery. That's how the Ben Ish Chai explains the idea that Haman had to be there for so long. Now, when it comes to Haman, it implies, certainly seems, and this is how the Targum Sheni explains, that he was killed by being hung on the tree. Now, when you kill somebody by hanging on the tree, l'chayra, there's three different ways to do it. One is hanging from a noose, and then he's strangled to death or something like that. Then there could be crucified, which is nailed to the tree. And then there could be impaled, which means that his body is pierced with the tree. When it comes, so l'chayra, from Pshuti Shel Mikra, it's mashma that Haman was one of those three, but it doesn't say which one of the three. The Targum says that it's mashma, if I recall correctly, it's mashma. Well, actually not, because the way the Targum Sheni puts it is that Haman says he's going to be done to him what was done to Yashka. So Yashka was l'chayru, as a legend goes, he was crucified. Yeah, we're not going to. That's in the Targum Sheni. I don't want to get too sidetracked by that. But when it comes to Haman's children, the story is very different because Haman's children are killed. The pasuk says in the beginning of chapter 9 that they're killed, and that's when we read the 10 sons of Haman in one breath. Yeah, and then the next day Esther says to Achashverosh, let's hang them on the tree. So they're hung on the tree. They weren't killed by hanging. They were killed. Tosfos says their heads were cut off. We'll see soon what the context of Tosfos is. They were decapitated. And then their bodies were hung on the tree. So what were they crucified? Were they impaled? What was going on? So again, clearly in the Megillah and the Mefarshim it doesn't say, but in this piyut it says it very clearly. If you look at line, it's the fourth paragraph, and the handouts, it's the last words of the second half of line 7. Loichem, the warrior, that's Haman. V'ninov, now in contemporary Hebrew, Ninov means great-grandchildren, but here it just means and his descendants. So Loichem and Ninov, Haman and his descendants, Huslu Mutzulavim, are hung in a way of Mutzlavim. Mutzlavim is the contemporary word they use in Hebrew for a cross, is it Slav, yeah? They are pierced with the tree like a string of fish. So this pattern clearly seems to be depicting the imagery of the sons of Haman and his sons being impaled, their bodies being pierced by the tree. I'm not saying this is everybody agrees with this. There's some discussion about it, but this is the way this Python is presenting the story. All right, and with that, we're going to move on to just one more vart is that the piyut starts after the refrain. The piyut starts with the words Tehillos Yisrael Ato Yoshev, which is a quote from a paraphrase of Tehillim Chav Beis, which is attributed to Esther, that Esther herself said that prayer on her way to Achashverosh, so appropriate that Antanas Esther will be starting off the piyut with those words. Okay, let's move on to the previous Slicha, which in Yosidr is on page 437. Now here, unfortunately, the way it's printed in most Siddurim, and certainly in the Telas Hashem Siddur, is one long paragraph, so it's harder to see the features that we're going to point out. But the truth is, they could have just as well done it the same way, meaning it is comprised of a bunch of paragraphs, numerous paragraphs, which all comprise of 4 phrases. So for this part, look at the handouts, because I've split it up into paragraphs and color-coded. So you're looking at the page, there's no page numbers, but it's the page that has 20 lines on it. You see that? There's only one of the handout pages that has 20 lines. And it's the piyut that starts with the words, Atoh Hakel Oiseh Pelois, you are the God who does wonders. Now, this piyut is written, before we say what the piyut is, let's talk for just a couple of moments about the author. The author of this piyut is Reb Shimon HaGadol Mimagensia, Reb Shimon HaGadol of Mainz, who has written many, many piyutim. There are numerous, he's one of the earliest Ashkenazic Paitonim, and there are many, many piyutim that we say throughout the year, which are authored by him. It's probably true to say that in Chabad, this is not true of other communities, but I think it's true to say that in Chabad, most of the piyutim that we say on Shachris of Rosh Hashanah come from him. Without getting into why Chabad is different in Rosh Hashanah than that, but certainly many of the piyutim we say in Rosh Hashanah morning come from him. I'll say a few names just for those who might mean something. Asisi Lachananach, the Chazan starts off with, that's from him on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Shmoi Mefarim Adas Chevloi, that whole piyut comes from him. I'll just mention one more, which many people, again, not Chabad Minhag, but many people say every Shabbos, the Zemer Baruch Hashem Yom Yom Yamos Lonu Yashar Pidyon, that also comes from him. And there many of his piyutim sections of his piyutim have been made into songs by chazonim over the years, and certainly in the last couple of decades with the booming of Jewish music, many singers, Yossi Green and Avram Fried and Mordechai and David and many others, have taken many of their songs are quotes from tefillos or piyutim written by Mordechai, by Reb Shimon HaGadol. One that comes to mind is anyway, there's many others. And in fact, this Asisi Lachanonach, we already mentioned that one. There's a few songs on Asisi. Anyway, but actually on this piyut itself that we're going to learn about now, that we say here on Tanis Esther, there are two contemporary singers who have composed songs on it. Oh, I should say, the first is Avram Fried, who in one of his very early albums, maybe it was his earliest album, I'm not sure, it was called, I think, No Jew Will Be Left Behind. And over there he took the famous song of Yedid Nefesh of Harachamon, and he applied it to the last two paragraphs of this piyut, which starts with the words Kanei L'Shimcha. So if you look on page 438, that's the last paragraph, the last few lines of page 438, and he sang Kanei L'Shimcha, Kanei L'Shimcha, Noira V'Nikdash, Chazei Charmecha. Anyway, so some of you may remember that. And the other is Yossi Green composed a song which is sung by Chazan Halfkat, which you may have heard. It goes Kanei L'Shimcha, Noira V'Nikdash, and it goes. Both of those songs go all the way through the end of this piyut. What are the primary features of this piyut? So again, look at the handouts where you have color-coded, it's going to be easy to see. So first of all, every paragraph contains 4 phrases which rhyme with each other. So those are, I've only done so for the first 2 paragraphs, highlighted them in green, but it's true of all of the paragraphs. You look at the first paragraph, Pila Ois, Neira Ois, Mitla Ois, Tachlo Ois. The second paragraph, Medonim, Adonim, Adinim, Adonim. And so on and so forth throughout the whole thing. Then the acrostic is the aleph base in the order. So that goes, if you're looking at, that goes through the first number of paragraphs. If you're looking on your handouts, it's from line 1 through line 11, highlighted in red, aleph base gimel daled, all the way through taf. And then after that, I've highlighted in blue the continued acrostic to the end of the piyut is his name, Shimon Bar Yitzchak, Chazak, ve'ematz. And then he does something which, again, Avi, this is probably familiar to you from you daven Shachar sometimes on Rosh Hashanah, right? So this is probably familiar to you from Rosh Hashanah as well. Reb Shimon does this a lot, that he'll end his piyut with the first words of whatever is coming up next, right? So there's a number of his piyutim on Rosh Hashanah of Rosh Hashanah do that. Certainly Asisi Lachanonach does. And others. So he does that as well here, where he finishes Chazak v'Amatz, and then the last line of the poem is Keil Melech Yoshev al Kisei Rachamim, which leads you straight into Keil Melech Yoshev al Kisei Rachamim. So that's a poetic feature of his. Not only his, many Paitonim do that, but he does it a lot. And I've often liked to point out that David HaMelech does the same in Tehillim, with the last 5 chapters all ending and beginning him with the same word Hallelujah. So it's and some people, you could hear, some people have a minhag when they daven to sort of to recite it in a way that strings the paragraphs together. Okay, now that we've gotten the features of the poem out of the way, let's look a little bit at what the poem actually says. So starts off by saying, okay, Ato Kelos applies, you are God who does wonders, and you've shown wonders. And he references a medrash. So the second and third paragraph are based on a medrash. The medrash says that Hashem knew that Haman was going to come and decree against the Jewish people that he would pay the shkalim, he would pay the money, the shekels, to Achashverosh for permission to annihilate the Jews. And Hashem preceded the refuah to the makir, preceded the cure to the solution to the problem by commanding the Jewish people to give the mitzvah of machzas hashekel, of bringing shekels to the Beis Hamikdash. And this is also why we read the Parsha Shkalim in the lead up to Purim. Right? So, what were the shekels used for? So the shekels were used in the Beis Hamikdash, the machzas hashekel were used for the karbanis, but the way the Torah tells us, the way it's written in the Torah, as we write in Parsha Shkalim, is that it's used for the adonim, for the sockets, the base, the foundation of the Mishkan, and Chazal deduce from that that's something that has to be repeated every year, and the money is used for the karbanis. So all of this is alluded to in the second and third paragraphs of this piyut, where he says, starting from the middle of line 3 on your handouts, Zamam lishka leginzi adonim chalifim as kikra adonim. He plotted to give money to the treasuries of the king instead of the Jewish people who gave the money for the 100 for the 100 kikar, the 100 talents of silver, which fashioned the adonim, the sockets of the Mishkan. However, line 5, you told your flock to precede that by giving the machzas hashekel, and that way you save them, as the poem continues to say. Line 9 is somewhat interesting. I mean, it's all interesting, but I'm just picking out a few lines. Obviously, everybody could read it in the Hebrew and the English. If anybody has a specific word that they want help to translate, I'm happy to try and do so. But let's look at line 9. Pur nepach ba'ivim lishloit. Seliva hucha nagogi litloit. So, seliva, again, we have that same word for the crucifixion of seliva, which again, it's not a word that's found in the Megillah. In the Megillah, the word is used telia. But here, the Paitonim, who are clearly, these are Ashkenazi Paitonim, and they're certainly influenced by Christianity and Yoshka and that whole thing. So they're using the word saliva. So the saliva was prepared to absorb the agogi, that's Haman. And then he says like this, Kala obala pnei haloit haloit. So haloit haloit is a paraphrase of a pasuk, which means something a little bit different in context. In the original pasuk, the second haloit is connected to the next word. So pnei haloit, the haloit means covered. So basically, in the context over here, what the Python means is to destroy those who are covered, who their face is covered in shame, or something along those lines. And then there's a very interesting line, the last words of line 9, Rivei those who fought against your people, ba'ashmanim laloit, to darken with ashmanim. What are ashmanim? So it turns out that ashmanim is a word that appears only once in the entire Tanakh, and it means, there's a big discussion, there's a big machlokas as to what it means, but most commentaries and indeed the Paitonim use it in the context of meaning a grave. So darken them up in their graves. There's a machlokas. Doinash says that it means the opposite. It means fat and anyway. But the Paitonim clearly accept the opinion that it means graves or something dark, or at least something along the lines of graves. Just looking through if there was anything else I wanted to. In line 13, it talks about 3 and not 4, which is a reference to the Gemara that initially the sages did not want to make Purim into a holiday, they did not want to make Megillah Esther into part of Tanakh, because there was supposed to be only 3 references to Amalek, not 4. So the 3 are B'Shalach, Kiseitse, and in the book of Shmuel. But then they found another limud from Pasuk that did allow for 4, so that's the reference to 3 and 4 in line 13 of the poem. And then, like I said, it finishes off with what's now become a famous composition of Yossi Green and Chazan Helfgott. Let's move on to the very first piyut, and here there's going to be referencing quite a number of midrashim, and hopefully we'll have time to go through the bulk of it. So, what page is this in the Siddur? On your handouts, it's the long page, the one that has 29 lines. And in the Siddur, anybody have the page still? 434. Sorry? 434 in the annotated Siddur. Adam b'chum aleinu chil achazasnu lirid. So before we talk about the poem, let's talk for just a couple of moments about the author of the poem. The author of the poem is Menachem ben Machir, also from the same city. I believe he's later, but he's also Ashkenazi German from Mainz and also Regensburg. And a number of piyutim of his that are said throughout the year. He also wrote a Sefer Halacha called Ma'aseh Mechiri, which has never been published. I don't even know if there's a complete manuscript of it or a partial manuscript of it available somewhere, but his halachic works have never been published. But there are a number of piyutim that are of his that are said. I will mention those piyutim of his that are said in Chabad that I know of, that I could think of. On Tisha B'Av, there's one of the kinnis we say on Tisha B'Av, Eva La'Orer. It refers to the Tatnu, to the first Crusades of 1096. So that's written by him. And then also on Simchas Torah, we say Mershus, the Mershus that we say for the Chosim Bereshis, Mershus, Miroim Amal Kol Bracha V'Shira, I think it is. So that one was also written by Menachem ben Machir. And then also on Selichos of Shiva Asa B'Tammuz, there is a piyut, there's one of the Selichos, Amorei Rebechi, Mepnei Yad Shalucha Ba'i, which we say in Shiva Asa B'Tammuz. So those are three piyutim of Menachem ben Machir, in addition to the one that we're learning today, that Chabad say throughout the year. There are others, I believe in, at least on top of my head, I can't think, and I think I checked Wikipedia also, but I can't think of any others from him that Chabad say. So those are the 3 or 4 that would be familiar to people in Chabad. Okay, what are the features of the poem? So again, you have everything color-coded. Let's just go through it quickly. First of all, every paragraph is 4 phrases that rhyme with each other. So the first paragraph, again, I've highlighted it in green, Liroid, Limoid, Misoid, Oid, etc. You have the order going through from Aleph to Taf. That's highlighted in red. The first letter, the acrostic, goes from Aleph to Taf. And then he spells out his name. That's starting from line 16, highlighted in blue. Miher Nochatz, Choisam, Meninvei Ben, right? So it spells out Menachem, what does it say? Menachem Bar Berebi, Menachem Berebi Machir, Yichyeh, Amen v'Amen. Okay? May he live. Amen v'Amen. Okay, now, this piyut has another feature which we didn't see in any of the other piyutim, which is really a masterpiece of art to be able to do this. Reb Shimon HaGadol also does this in many of his piyutim, just not in the one that he does, that we say in Ato Kei Lo Yisaplois. Yeah, but here he does it, and that is that the last line of every paragraph is a quote from a pasuk. So it has to be, the last line of every paragraph has to be a direct quote from a pasuk. Maybe one of 2 of them are not an exact quote, they're paraphrased, but for the most part it's all a direct quote. And it has to rhyme with the rest of that paragraph. And of course, it has to make sense in the context. So there's a lot of art and creativity and clever work going into doing that. Sometimes you even have a pasuk where he puts the comma in a different place than it is in the original pasuk. So for example, the very last line, in the Megillah, Mordechai says to Esther, if you'll be quiet at this time, the salvation will come to the Jews from somewhere else. So the way he quotes the pasuk, he puts at this time, which in the original context of the pasuk is 2 separate sentences. He puts them together. So that's something that's just clever in this piyut. Piyut starts off, okay, so I just want to mention briefly, every line of this piyut is referring to a medrash. So in order to really, or a Gemara or a medrash or something, so in order to really appreciate this piyut, you have to be familiar with a tremendous amount of Gemara and tremendous amount of medrashim and see what he's alluding to. We're not going to go through everything, but we'll read a few things. So, Adam b'kum aleinu chola chazasno liroid is a reference to the Gemara, which talks about the pasuk in Tehillim, where it says b'kum aleinu Adam. Yeah, we say it on Shabbos davening. What's the Russian? 1 second, advance. Hold on, sorry. Yeah, the b'kum aleinu Adam. The pasuk says in Tehillim. And the Gemara says, why does it say B'kum Aleinu Adam? Why doesn't it say B'kum Aleinu Melech? Because we're talking when it wasn't a king. Who is the person who's not a king who stood up against the Jewish people? Haman. So that's why he starts with Adam B'kum Aleinu, is a reference to that Gemara. Um, line number 6 is referencing a Gemara that says, somewhat of a famous Gemara, but that the Gemara says, I think it's a Pshim ben Yechai, who says that the Jewish people, why would the Jewish people, why did they deserve that it should be decreed on them to be annihilated? Because they took pleasure in the party of Achashverosh. Then they said, his Talmidim said to him, okay, but that would make sense for the Jews of Shushan. What about the Jews in the rest of the empire who did not partake in the party? So he says, because they served idols. So the Gemara says, one second, if that's the case, so why taka did they deserve to be spared? Why did they deserve such a great miracle? So the Gemara says, because really they didn't really mean it. They were just doing it because they felt coerced to do so. So it was only lefanim, it was only sort of as a front, it was only an external thing that they did. And so therefore Hashem also never really meant to annihilate them. It was just a ruse that Hashem pulled off to be ma'orer them to Shuvah. So that's the reference in line 6. Chavu lefanim v'ridam b'hasaras tabas la'achaloisam. So they only sinned lefanim externally, and ridam b'hasaras tabas la'achaloisam. Hashem disciplined them with removal of the ring, and that's also a reference to the Gemara over there that what Achashverosh's removal of his ring accomplished, all the prophets and prophetesses that stood to the Jewish people were not able to accomplish. In other words, the degree of teshuvah that the Jewish people were able to accomplish by the threat of Achashverosh removing his ring and giving Haman the okay to do whatever he wanted, that was more than the Nevi'im were able to accomplish. There's a medrash in Esther Rabbah which describes at great length. You know what? I'm going to read sections of the medrash. Amar Rish Lakish says, "B'shasha Amar Haman Arasha Lachashverosh Beina Abedis Yisrael Min Ha'olam." When Haman Arasha said to the king, "Let us destroy the Jewish people from the world," Amar Achashverosh said to him, "Lo yicholta lo, you are not going to manage to overcome the Jewish people, because Hashem has not completely abandoned them. Come and look. What Hashem did, what the God of the Jews did to previous kings who tried to raise their hand against the Jews, who were greater kings and more and bigger in number than us. Anybody who tried to destroy the Jewish people from the world, who plotted against them, has been nullified from the world, and they are a mushal to all the other people of the world. In other words, people say, "Oh, you want to have a bitter end like that guy?" So us, me, Haman, and Achashverosh says to Haman, us who are even weak compared to them, certainly we are not going to be able to overcome the Jewish people. Abandon these stupid ideas of yours. Leave it. Nevertheless, Haman did not let go, and he kept on bugging Achashverosh concerning this matter, called Shata v'Shata, at every opportunity. It's interesting, suddenly in the middle of the Medrash it switches from Aramaic to Hebrew, I don't know why, and from now on the rest of the Medrash is in Hebrew. And he gives him bad advice on Yisrael concerning the Jewish people. Achashverosh says to him, "Okay, you're pestering me so much. Let's go and get advice from the wise people and the astrologers or the other, how do you say that word? Diviners. So they collected all the wise guys. They all came to him. Achashverosh said to them, "Would you like to try and genocide this nation from the world?" Who is the fool who wants to try and get rid of the entire Jewish nation at once? The world cannot exist if you annihilate the whole Jewish people, because the world only exists in the schus of the Torah. the pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, that if not for the Torah, which is referred to as the Bris Yom V'Layla, so then the world would not exist. Anyway, it goes on, and then the end of the Medrash goes like this. Haman said to them, that God which you're so afraid of, who drowned Paro in the sea and did all the miracles to the Jews that you hear, he's already old. He's senile already. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed his home, his temple, and burned his palace. V'higlas Yisrael, and he drove the Jews into exile, and spread them out amongst the nations. So it must be that God is no longer, the God of the Jews is no longer powerful, and he's already become old. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Tehillim, and this we say it's Tehillim, it's Psalm 94. We say it on the Shir Shal Yom for Wednesday morning. That Haman said that basically we're going to be able to get rid of the Jewish people, and Hashem isn't even going to notice because he is old and senile. Okay, so this whole long medrash was known to the Python, and not only did he know this medrash, he took for granted that the people reading the poem are also going to know this medrash, and therefore he alludes to it in just a few words at line 5. Let's do line 4 and 5. My enemies. Enemied with, it has the noun and the verb of enemy over there, with their plots to ambush the Jewish people, and they said that the Jewish people won't be able, the Jewish God will not notice what he is doing. I want to do one more medrash, which I thought, it's here. Yeah, one more medrash which I want to do and show you how this is alluded to in the piyut over here, and this is also a medrash, if I recall correctly, it's from the same section of Medrash Rabbah of Esther. Omar Rabbi Yishmael said, 18,500 people, Jews, went to the party. And they ate, and they drank, and they became, they ate and drank, and they ate and they drank, and they became drunk. I guess that means they did Averis. Miyad Omad Soton v'Hilshin Alei, and the Soton got up and reported against them. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu reported on the crime in front of the Hashem. And the Satan said to Hashem, Master of the universe, how long will you cleave to this nation, who depart their hearts and their faith from you? If you wish, God, get rid of this nation from the world. They're not doing tshuva. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, if I annihilate the Jewish people, what will happen to the Torah? Master of the universe, you'll have to suffice with the Torah study of the Elyonim, the angels. And so it seems, the Medrash seems to be saying that God was somewhat unconvinced to get rid of the Jewish people. I don't know how this fits with the earlier Medrash the Gemara brought, that it was only the Fanim. But at that time, Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, what benefit do I have? What is this? It's like expressing frustration. This nation for whom I have done so many miracles and wonders against all those people who have gone up against them, and look what they do to me. I will make their memory be laid to rest from amongst mankind. Miyad Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu, so Hashem said to the Satan of Megillah, bring me a scroll, and I will write a decree that the Jewish people should be annihilated. So the Satan went and brought the scroll, and the Torah itself sees what's going on, and the Torah comes out, emerges with a widow's clothes, so in clothing of mourning, and the Torah itself starts crying to Hashem, and the Malachim hear the Sefer Torah crying, and they cry to Hashem, and they say, if the Jewish people are going to be annihilated from the world, what do we need it for? And this is the meaning of the pasuk in Yeshעיהו. So now there's a whole scene, there's a whole protest going on. The Torah is crying to Hashem, the Malachim are crying to Hashem, and now the sun and the moon join the party. And they diminished their light. Shenamar, as the pasuk says elsewhere in Yeshעיהו, Al b'shamayim kadrus v'sak osam ksusam. Basically, I will dress the sky, the heavens up with darkness. Okay, so there's a major backlash happening, right? Hashem and the Satan are agreeing to annihilate the Jewish people. It's almost about to be inscripted, but there's a major backlash. There's a lot of counter pressure. At that time, who joins the party? Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Zachal HaToiv goes with a rush, but Behala, with a rush, he goes to Avos HaOlam. Who is the Avos HaOlam? Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Moshe ben Amram, and he also goes to Moshe ben Amram. It's interesting because you have very similar imagery in one of the Kinnis on Tisha B'Av about going to Moshe and to the Avis, but there, in there, there's a strong reference about Ma'aras and Machpelah, about going to the cave area. Here it doesn't talk about the Kfarim, it just talks about going to them. And Eliyahu Hanavi says to Avraham and to Yitzchak and to Yaakov and to Moshe Rabbeinu, hello, Avos ha'olam redumim. The patriarchs of the world are sleeping when they're needed, and you're not paying attention to the trouble that is befalling your children. The angels are crying, the sun and the moon and the stars and the mazalos and the heavens and earth, v'chol tzva hamarim, and all the hosts of the heaven are all crying bitterly, and you're standing from afar. You're not doing it. You're not even paying attention, right? Not paying attention. That's the worst thing. So the Amrullah, so Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and Moshe said to him, who's him? Eliyahu Hanavi, what they do wrong? So Eliyahu Hanavi says, I'll tell you why. Because they benefited from the Suda of Achashverosh. And because of this, they have been decreed that they be annihilated from the world. So Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov say, okay, if that's the case, if they've violated the word of Hashem, what can be done about it? So Avraham and Yaakov, they don't intervene. By the way, it is reminiscent of a Gemara where Avraham, and if I recall correctly in the Gemara, I'm trying to remember right now, Avraham and Yitzchak, Hashem says, Banecha chatu, and there it goes, Yaakov. Yaakov certainly doesn't stand up for them. There's a parallel Gemara about the Avis, or some of the Avis not standing up for the Jewish people because they've sinned. Perhaps I'll look it up in a moment. Chazer Eliyahu. So then Eliyahu goes and he said to Moshe, "Okay, I can't get anywhere with the Avis. The Avis are not willing to intercede for the Jewish people. You are the faithful shepherd. Shepherd, how many times did you stand in defense of the Jewish people when they were in a dangerous situation, and you managed to cancel the decrees against them, the vilshi hashchis, that they not be destroyed?" This is the pasuk in Tehillim, Luli Moshe b'chidei amid b'peretz. So Moshe says to Eliyahu, I want you to find out for me, is there any good person in that generation? So he says, yes, his name is Mordechai. So he says, go and tell him, you should go and tell Mordechai what's going on about this decree. So that, in other words, go and tell him that the Jewish people are going to be put in such a decree, because this is when it's happening on high. So the whole thing down here hasn't played out yet. So go and tell Mordechai what's going to happen. So that he should start praying. Misham, from down there. V'ani and I, Moshe, mikan, from up here. And we will ask for mercy from Hashem. So Moshe Rabbeinu has a plan. There's a decree that's pending. The tefillos of Moshe Rabbeinu on high, in conjunction with the tefillos of Mordechai HaTzadik down here, are going to be enough to overcome this decree. So Eliyahu Hanavi says to Moshe Rabbeinu, no, this is not a pending decree. It's already been written. So Moshe says to Eliyahu Hanavi, well, it depends. If the decree that's already written is sealed with tit, with earth, with clay, our tefillos, our prayers will be able to overcome that decree. But if it is, if the decree is sealed with blood, then there's no way to overcome this decree. So Eliyahu Hanavi reports back to him, don't worry, good news, betit hi chasuma, it's decreed with earth, not with blood. And then, so Moshe Rabbeinu tells him, go and tell Mordechai, and he went to tell Mordechai, and that's what the pasuk means in the beginning of the fourth chapter of the Megillah, Mordechai Yodas Kol Asher Na'u, so that Mordechai knew. How did Mordechai knew? Because Eliyahu Hanavi told him. Why did Eliyahu Hanavi tell him? Because Moshe Rabbeinu told Eliyahu Hanavi to do so. Now, in a moment, I'll get back to discuss what this whole idea of the blood and the earth and sealing the decree is. But before we do that, let's go look back in our poem, in our piyut over here, and we'll see a number of references to this medrash. First of all, in line number 8, Yida Remez HaKoros, that Hashem let Hashem Yida, he let it be known. Remez, with a hint, HaKoros, that which was going to happen to the Jewish people. L'chayra is a reference to this medrash of Mordechai being told ahead of time to address things. And then look at let's read let's read lines 10 to 13 on the page. Makshiv dvar sheker kosav sitno ve'etzev. The one who listened to the lies wrote the decree. That's Achashverosh, who listened to the lies of Haman. Nisativ bigdei srod kutov min haketzev. Achashverosh had the audacity to wear the bigdei srod, to wear the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, when he made a mistake about the counting. That refers to the Gemara that Achashverosh thought that the 70 years were already up, and so that the Jews were going to be in Galus forever. So he said, okay, so then it's okay for him to start use those clothing. So he makes a party with the shoinim, which those vessels, those utensils, which the Megillah refers to as shoinim, which the Gemara tells us refers to the utensils of the Beis Hamikdash. And then who joins the party? And again, this last line in 11 is a quote from a pasuk, but he's taking it to mean that the Satan joins the party, right? Because that's what this medrash says. The Satan comes to see what's going on in the party, and he goes to report back to Hashem. Okay, and he says, line 12, the people who are dwelling in Shushan, so he opened up his mouth to lahastinam, which is the verb of Satan, to block or to cause harassment to the Jewish people, or lahaskiram, and to deliver them b'yad noisin michram, into the hands of their host king. So the rock, that's Hashem, hiskim lichte v'geras la'abed sivram. Hashem agreed to write a letter to destroy them. Amarti afeim, and now quote from pasuk that Hashem says, afeim ashbisa ben Zichram, that I will annihilate the Jewish people. Okay, so again, it's all paraphrasing this medrash. The Satan comes to the party, he sees what's going on, he reports to Hashem, and he convinces Hashem, and Hashem agrees to write this letter. What happens next? Line 14. Kedoshim malachi hashareis Mariv Kohen B'tzaka, the angels themselves are crying out to Hashem, and they're saying to Hashem, Rachim Abit Labris, look at your covenant, Val Tofer Lachiko, don't violate your covenant. Shama Meirasha, who's Meirasha heard? Think a minute, who is Meirasha? Meirasha, Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. What comes next? Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Before that? Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. What's the next word? Meirasha, right? Meirasha is the Torah. So Shama Meirasha, the Torah heard. Vatilbash Bigdei Almunus Umaka, and the Torah itself donned clothing of widowness, right? Again, all paraphrasing this medrash. Okay. Tishbi Sam Ezer Sak Masnav Tichboshes. Tishbi, anybody know who Tishbi is? Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Tishbi. So Tishbi is Eliyahu Hanavi. He wears sackcloth. He hurried was right there in the medrash as well, to let this be known, Yeshene Machpel Avish Shloshos, to those who sleep in the Machpel, in the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, that's the Avish who are resting, who are buried in the double cave in the Machpel, which is Avish Shloshos. Nochatz L'roye Malach HaNidam L'Sashis, and he poked, whatever, he pointed to the shepherd, to Moshe Rabbeinu, why are you guys sleeping? You have to get up. Come and daven to Hashem. So now, listen to this. Choisam tit, line 18. Choisam tit hashanasa levilshon siper. That which I'm sorry, Choysam Tita Shanasa, the seal of cement. Remember, that was the point of the punchline of the Medrash was, is it cement or is it blood? So the seal of cement that was made, La Bilshon Siper, he told the Eliyahu Navi, recounted this to the Bilshon. The Bilshon is Mordechai, who's referred to as the Bilshon because he knows many languages. And then, Ninveh Lamdu, and they learned from Ninveh to be able to do Teshuvah, etc., etc., and he did Shuvah, and they gathered the children, and etc., and that's what got rid of the decree. So again, you have here 8, 9, 10, a whole number of lines of this piyut, which are in a poetic way alluding to this medrash. And again, the Python is taking familiarity with this and all the other midrashim for granted. I'll just conclude with a short idea about the tit and the dam. What is this whole idea that if the decree is sealed with tit, with clay, so then you can override it with prayer. But if it is decreed with if it's sealed with blood, so then it's shenfafal and it's too late. So the interesting thing is that I was like, okay, there's got to be somebody who talks about there's many things in the Medrash which you could ask, okay, what's the significance of this? The Medrash is not here to tell us a historic recount as much as what does it represent? Why is it that, for example, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are not going to defend the Jewish people because they've sinned and Moshe, right? There's a lot to unpack over here. But just this, somebody's got to have addressed what's this idea of is the decree sealed with cement or with clay or with blood? So on a quick search, I found that a number of people have addressed it, all from the same school, or at least from the same time, and they all say the same thing, and I didn't find anybody else addressing it. The 3 people who I saw addressing it are all living in Sfas in the 16th century. One is the Al-Shikh, the other is Reb Shlomo Alkabatz, the author of the Chadayri, and the other is Reb Elisha Galitu, also not very familiar with him, I've heard of him before, but also same living in Sfas in the late 1500s. And they all say the same thing, that that tit represents the clay, that represents earthly materialism. Blood is the life, that's more spiritual. So in other words, what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling Eliyahu Navi is, if the reason they're decreed to be annihilated is, I saw, by the way, the Chidah also brings this. The Chidah is 200 years later, but he also brings the same idea. That if the reason for the decree against the Jewish people is because of a materialistic indulgence, because, as it turns out that it was, because they indulged in the party of Achashverosh, so then that's something that can be counter, it could be fixed, it could be rectified by fasting. You get too much indulging, so you have to do teshuvah, you fast, and there was too much indulgence, so now you have the opposite of indulgence. You have, how do you say in English the opposite of indulgence? Abstaining is probably a better word, okay. And that undoes the damage that was done by indulging in Achashverosh's party. But if it's sealed with blood, if it's because of a spiritual rebellion, if it's because of Avodah Zarah, so then that's going to be something that's impossible to rectify, and that's what the Medrash is alluding to by saying that, the good news in the Gemara, it's a machloek. The Gemara says two, Reb Shimon says both. But in this Medrash, we only bring the reason about the party, and it was because they indulged too much in the party of Achashverosh and they took pleasure, etc., that therefore Lamdu Meninve, as the Python says, it was undone. I don't think the Medrash actually said that explicitly, at least not in the section that I copied and pasted for myself. But in the Piyut, it talks beferish about learning from Ninveh to fast, because fasting is the opposite of indulgence, and that was what undid. All right, and okay, so hopefully this will make your davening on Thursday morning at least a little bit more meaningful. Thank you for joining.